All right, this is chapter 26, The Triumph of Conservatism, and this is the period from 1969 to 1988. So the liberal 1960s will give way to this period of conservatism. Here is an image of President Ronald Reagan on the left and the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and they're going to help usher in the end of the Cold War, which we'll talk about later. So President Nixon is going to be elected in 1968 after Lyndon Johnson chooses not to seek re-election. And Nixon's domestic policy, he's mainly interested in foreign policy. So he allowed the Democratic Congress to put forward their agendas, and he was more concerned with events happening in Vietnam. So the Great Society will be greatly expanded, the welfare state will be expanded. Nixon supported affirmative action programs. And he's going to spend liberally on these social services and also on environmental initiatives. So Nixon and welfare, the federal government's going to guarantee at least a minimum income for all Americans. Now, half the recipients were black, and a lot of conservative politicians would attack this as, people are trying to live off honest taxpayers uh, rather than actually do the work. But obviously, if you go back to the days of pre-civil rights, African Americans really didn't stand a chance, and that's why they were so disadvantaged. However, Nixon's plan for this guaranteed annual income did not pass Congress. Nixon embraced the idea of affirmative action. So, in order to increase minority employment, positions would be reserved for minorities, not only for colleges, but also within the job market to try to boost this equality. In terms of Nixon and foreign policy, he's going to send money to pro-American dictatorships in Iran, the Philippines, and South Africa. The CIA launched a military coup in Chile in 1973, which overthrew and killed President Allende, and installed a bloody regime ruled by General Pinochet, which led to the deaths of a couple 100,000 people. Nixon's probably most famous accomplishment is opening up relations with communist China, who the United States had been ignoring since 1949, and realizing that they were separate from the Soviet Union and an emerging world power themselves. Nixon realized the importance of dealing with China and opening them up to the United States. Nixon's also going to be the first president to visit the Soviet Union, and he's going to sign nuclear arms treaties that will set up a peaceful coexistence between the two superpowers. There's Nixon in China. To try to end the Vietnam War, Nixon adopted a policy known as Vietnamization, where American soldiers would be replaced with trained South Vietnamese troops. However, this policy did not work. The United States was determined to stop the enemy supply lines from coming into Vietnam, and they knew that supplies were coming from neighboring Cambodia. So Nixon ordered bombing of Cambodia secretly, didn't tell the public, didn't tell Congress, and that's going to lead to the destabilization of the government. A new government led by the Khmer Rouge took power, and a Holocaust ensued in which millions were massacred in the 1970s. When Americans got wind of these bombings in Cambodia, there were student protests nationwide. The most famous one, incredibly tragic, was the massacre at Kent State, where 4 anti-war protesters were killed. One girl wasn't even protesting, just walking to class, and the National Guard opened fire on them. There were 350 colleges that had strikes, and people were also upset with the war too, because the army was mainly composed of working class whites and poor racial minorities. You would receive a college deferment and get out of the war if you could go to college. So the rich were able to not fight in the war. So it was incredibly unpopular in the United States. Very iconic photo at the Kent State shooting. Support for the Vietnam War declined markedly as well. The My Lai massacre, 350 civilians, mostly women and children, were massacred. Americans were upset with guerrilla attacks, took it out on unsuspecting villagers. 1969, the Pentagon Papers were, that was in 69, the Pentagon Papers were published in 71, and these were classified government documents showing multiple presidents had misled the American public regarding Vietnam going way back. 1973, the War Powers Act was instituted, which limited the president's authority to wage war for up to 60 days without congressional approval, and the writing was on the wall for the war to come to an end. United States troops were withdrawn in 1973. The bombing stopped, no more draft, and 2 years later, North Vietnam was easily able to topple South Vietnam, especially without the United States' support. So this became a military disaster for the United States and our first loss in a war. Nixon's undoing is going to be the Watergate scandal. 1972, Nixon was seeking re-election, and 5 former employees of Nixon's, members of the re-election committee, were caught breaking into the Democratic headquarters to try to tap the phones, and they were arrested. The Washington Post journalist revealed that people close to Nixon had ordered the operation and tried to cover up Nixon's involvement. Nixon recorded all of his conversations in his Oval Office, and when these tapes were requested, Nixon refused. And then the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to provide them. One of the tapes that was submitted by Nixon had 18.5-minute gap, which showed his duplicity. So by mid-1974, it was obvious that Nixon had ordered the cover-up of Watergate, and it was recommended that Nixon be impeached for conspiracy to obstruct justice. And right before that happened, Nixon resigned from the presidency, only president to ever quit the job 2 years before his term was over. Vice President Gerald Ford took over, later pardoned Nixon to try to put this whole embarrassing episode behind the country, and that destroyed his chances of re-election. So America had lost confidence in their government. Their president had resigned. He was about to be impeached. The Pentagon Papers had recently been revealed. Vietnam War was disastrous. And this is going to distract Americans from a looming economic crisis that was creeping up. So there was a decline in manufacturing in the 1970s. America had a trade deficit for the first time. The steel industry was devastated by imports coming into the country. The Vietnam War was incredibly costly for the United States, and prices kept rising and rising with inflation. Wars in the Middle East between Israel and neighboring countries, Egypt and Syria, led to a huge jacking up of the oil prices, and that created a huge energy crisis in America. The domestic auto industry was hurt because America was known for its big gas-guzzling cars, so people started buying more fuel-efficient foreign cars. Nixon's going to take the United States off of the gold standard, but that's only going to destabilize the world economy. So not only was there high inflation, but there was also a stagnant economic growth. Put them together, this is called stagflation. Here's a picture of the oil crisis, 1973. Fill up with the old salvation. And here's an image of the misery index, which just shows the high rates of unemployment and that rate of inflation, which is crippling to Americans. 1976 election, Gerald Ford running against Democratic nominee Jimmy Carter, and Carter was victorious. So he'll be the only Democrat in this period of conservatism, and it was only a one-time thing, 4 years. Carter, mostly known for his human rights politics. Biggest achievement was negotiating peace between Egypt and Israel. Also cut military aid to El Salvador, which had sponsored death squads. Combated poverty, and Carter, to this day, still fights for human rights, which is remarkable. Very famous image here of Jimmy Carter and Anwar Sadat. So we have Egypt and Israeli leaders here. 1979, the United States had supported the Shah since the early 1950s, and when the Shah was deposed by the Ayatollah Khomeini, um, he sought refuge in the United States. He needed cancer surgery. The United States was willing to take him in, and when Iran asked for his release to them, the United States refused, and then the American embassy was invaded, and the Americans held hostage. Carter organized a mission to free them, and it was disaster. Two helicopters crashed into each other. Nobody was saved, and the prisoners were not released until Ronald Reagan's first day as president. 444-day ordeal. Afghanistan, which some people link to the United States with their undoing with Vietnam, was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1979. High casualties, expensive, unpopular war, similar to what the United States faced in the 1960s. America is going to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics, which were held in the Soviet Union, and they're going to start providing arms and money to Islamic fundamentalist rebels in Afghanistan, which will later give rise to the Taliban. And one of those people was Osama bin Laden, which we'll talk about later. Here's television coverage of the Iranian hostage. So the election of 1980, Ronald Reagan is going to promise to end stagflation, to restore America's confidence and role in the world. Reagan was an actor back in the 40s and the 50s, and knew how to speak and really connect with the American public. Not a champion of the poor. He's going to shrink social welfare programs, condemned busing and affirmative action, but his popularity really was high throughout the 1980s. Reagan crushes Carter in the election of 1980, 91% to 9, almost Jimmy. So Ronald Reagan here addressing the Republican National Convention, oldest president ever elected. He was just shy of 70 years old. So Reagan's going to reduce union power, dismantle regulations, radically reduce taxes, especially for the wealthy. He believed in supply-side economics. His opponents called it trickle-down economics, where you cut taxes for the rich, and the idea is that they will use that savings to provide more jobs and to influence the economy. In that respect, but in actuality, it didn't work. And Reagan's heroes for this type of business were the 1920s Republicans, Coolidge and Harding. So 1981-82, America suffered a very severe recession, but throughout the 80s, the stock market will rebound and rise up considerably. Problem of inequality: the richest 1% owned 40% of the wealth, and that doubled in 20 years. Incomes were not spent productively. A lot of it was on luxury goods and real estate speculation, and African Americans faced an unemployment rate double that of whites. And federal spending, Cold War was in full force, led to the tripling of the national debt under Reagan. So here we see changes in families' real income rising from 1980 to 1990. Reagan in the Cold War. Reagan calls the Soviet Union an evil empire, and he's going to start up the largest military buildup in American history. Proposed a Star Wars initiative where satellites can shoot lasers down on any nuclear bomb launched at America. A lot of money spent on it, never came to fruition. And Reagan wanted to reassert America's world power. He's going to press NATO to deploy short-range nuclear missiles throughout Europe. Talked about winning a nuclear war, and that's going to spread alarm and fear in the 1980s, I remember. And he believed that the United States should support anti-communist regimes, even if they're not democratic. Reagan could have been impeached for the Iran-Contra affair, probably should have. Congress had told him he cannot